It was a cold morning, the kind where the sky hung low, grey and heavy, like a warning nobody bothered to heed. Jamal was already late. The bus would arrive in 5 minutes, but Jamal was standing at the corner of the street, staring down the narrow alley, his body frozen in place. The feeling was familiar, the tightening in his chest, the pull of dread creeping up his spine. It wasn't just the bus he was waiting for, or the hope that he might make it in time for school. It was the constant, ever-present fear of what could happen next. The world outside the walls of his small apartment was far more dangerous than any classroom he'd ever known. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, feeling the weight of his disability more acutely today. His legs ached from the crutches he used to help him walk, and he could already feel the strain building in his wrists. He hated the feeling of being different, hated the way people looked at him when he struggled to keep pace. But it wasn't just his disability that made him stand out. His skin made him a target. Jamal shifted on his feet, scanning the street. The world felt quieter than usual, as if the ground beneath him had stilled, waiting for something terrible to happen. He hated that feeling, that unsettling quiet. It was the calm before the storm. The streetlights buzzed faintly in the distance, and the sound of an approaching car grew louder. Jamal tightened his grip on the crutches, mentally preparing himself for the short walk to the bus stop. It wasn't far, just a few steps past the corner, but somehow every step always felt like a mile. He could already feel the eyes of strangers on him, some with pity, some with judgment. He glanced at the bus stop, seeing the usual crowd of people huddled there, waiting. But something was different today. A figure in uniform stood at the edge of the crowd, his posture rigid and unwelcoming. Jamal didn't need to look twice to know that it was Officer Reynolds. He was the one who always seemed to patrol these streets, a constant presence in a world that never gave him a reason to feel safe. Jamal tried to ignore him, trying to push the anxiety away. His mind raced, running through the scenarios in his head. He could take the long way around, avoid the officer, avoid the stairs. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't change anything. He could run, but where would he go? Would it matter? Would anyone care? His breath caught in his throat as the officer's eyes met his from across the street. It was just a glance, but it was enough. Jamal's stomach twisted into a knot. He wasn't sure why he felt it, but he knew something was about to happen. That strange, cold feeling crept down his spine once more. The officer took a step forward, his boots making sharp, deliberate noises against the pavement. Each step seemed to echo in the silence that surrounded Jamal, as though the world had become a backdrop for this single, inevitable moment. His fingers tightened around the crutches as if they could shield him from the impending storm. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the moment passed. The officer looked away, and the crowd shifted, the tension dissipating for a second. Jamal exhaled, but the knot in his chest didn't loosen. He forced his legs to move, one crutch, then the other, each step feeling heavier than the last. It was a slow, deliberate walk, and he hated every second of it. The officer's eyes were still on him, watching, waiting. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this time things might not go the way they always did. This time the quiet might shatter into something much worse. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the bus stop. The officer's figure loomed larger, more threatening with every step. Jamal knew that it wasn't just the bus he was running to catch. It was a desperate, almost futile hope to escape whatever dark force was silently gathering around him. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change forever. Jamal had always known that the world wasn't made for people like him. It wasn't just the crutches. It wasn't just the disability that slowed him down, or the way his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. No, it was something deeper. Something that weighed heavier with every step he took. Something that had been a part of him since the day he was born. A mark on his skin that no crutch or cane could shield him from. He could feel it now. The eyes of strangers, their judgment wrapped in every glance. It was the burden of being black in a world that made sure to remind you of it every day. As Jamal approached the bus stop, he could feel the officer's gaze lingering on him like a dark cloud. The uniformed man didn't try to hide it. His eyes were cold, his stance rigid, like he was waiting for something. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he reached the group of people huddled by the stop. It was always like this, wasn't it? Every day, the same. People standing around, not looking at each other, eyes fixed to the ground, pretending to ignore the tension in the air. And then there was him, always too aware of the stares, the whispers, the judgment. The bus stop was nearly empty, but Jamal still felt out of place. He knew the others were looking at him, some with curiosity, some with contempt. It didn't matter that they weren't saying anything. It was in the way they shifted when he came near, in the way their eyes flicked toward the ground or away from him altogether. But it wasn't the bystanders that caught his attention now. It was the officer. "Hey!" The shout rang out, sharp and sudden. The officer's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Jamal froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "You gonna just stand there or get on the damn bus?" Jamal didn't move. He felt his breath catch in his throat, his crutches feeling heavier by the second. The officer's voice wasn't just harsh, it was laced with something far darker, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't need to see the officer's face to know the contempt in his voice was rooted in something much deeper than mere irritation. The officer didn't see him as a person. He saw an obstacle, a nuisance, a thing to be dealt with, a thing that didn't belong in the same space. Jamal took a step back, uncertain, not sure what to do. The officer's eyes were locked onto him now, and the crowd around them seemed to shrink, their faces hidden behind the silent shields of their indifference. The officer took a step forward, his boots hitting the concrete with deliberate force. The weight of his presence seemed to press down on Jamal, like the air itself had grown thicker. "You deaf boy," the officer spat, his words sharp as knives. "Get on the bus. You're not going to get any special treatment just because you're, what? Crippled?" The words hit Jamal like a punch in the gut. His stomach churned, and for a moment he thought he might actually collapse. It was always like this, wasn't it? He was always other, always an outsider. It didn't matter what he did, how hard he tried, how much he worked to prove that he was more than his circumstances. To people like the officer, it was always the same. The color of his skin, the way he walked, the way he carried himself. None of it was ever enough to make him human in their eyes. Jamal's hand tightened on the crutches, knuckles white with the effort of holding them steady. He didn't want to say anything, didn't want to make it worse. But the words were there, sitting at the back of his throat. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the officer took another step closer. "You got a problem with me, boy?" The officer's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper, filled with a cold malice that made Jamal's stomach drop. "You think you're better than me just because you get to sit in that chair of yours? You think you deserve to be treated like everyone else?" The officer's eyes were burning into him now, filled with a venom that sent a cold shiver through Jamal's bones. He could feel the weight of the officer's stare, the cruelty in the way he regarded him, like a thing to be disposed of. Jamal opened his mouth to respond, but before he could get the words out, the officer shoved him hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. The crutches slipped from his hands as he fought to stay on his feet, but his legs couldn't hold him. He fell to the ground with a heavy thud, his crutches scattering across the pavement. The crowd around them remained eerily silent, as if they were too afraid to intervene, too afraid to be caught in the mess that was about to unfold. Jamal's breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to push himself back up. But the officer was already standing over him, a sneer on his face. "Pathetic," the officer muttered under his breath, his voice thick with disdain. "Just like all of you, always expecting handouts, always begging for attention. You should be grateful I even let you live, you little piece of garbage." Jamal's body trembled as he tried to steady himself. The pain in his legs was excruciating, but it wasn't the physical pain that hurt the most. It was the humiliation. The way the officer had looked at him, the way he had spoken to him. He wasn't a person to the officer. He was just something in the way, something to be shoved aside. As Jamal struggled to stand, he caught a glimpse of the bus approaching. It was coming closer, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. All he could think about was the officer's eyes, the coldness in them that reminded him of everything he had always feared. He was nothing more than a target, an easy one at that. And in that moment, as he lay on the pavement, broken and humiliated, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he would feel this way. The officer didn't let Jamal get up right away. He stood over him, a towering figure, his boots planted firmly on the ground, as if he owned the very pavement. Jamal's body felt like it was made of lead, each movement slow and agonizing, the sting in his knees, the sharp pain shooting through his legs, was nothing compared to the burning humiliation that spread through him like wildfire. Every inch of his skin crawled with the weight of the officer's eyes, filled with disdain and cruelty. He could feel the air around him growing thick, heavy with tension. "Get up," the officer growled, his voice low and laced with venom. "You're not going to lie there and play the victim, are you?" Jamal's heart raced. The officer's hand was on his shoulder now, pushing him roughly, as if he were nothing more than a piece of trash in the gutter. He wanted to shout, wanted to fight back, but his body refused to cooperate. The officer's cruel words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. "You should be grateful I even let you live." Grateful. That word twisted in Jamal's mind. Grateful for what? For the officer's pity? For the fact that he hadn't been beaten to a pulp, or worse, shot like so many others before him? Grateful for being made to feel small, worthless, invisible? He tried to rise, but his hands were shaking, and his legs didn't have the strength to hold him up. The crutches had fallen to the side, discarded like yesterday's trash, leaving him even more vulnerable. He could hear the murmurs from the crowd around him, the whispers of judgment. Some people looked away, pretending they didn't see. Others watched with cold, detached eyes, their faces etched with indifference. None of them moved to help. None of them stepped forward to stop what was happening. Jamal could feel the weight of their apathy pressing down on him. They were complicit in this, weren't they? They were just as responsible for the violence, for the degradation. They were the silent audience to his suffering, the ones who would go home and forget about this moment, just like they'd forgotten all the others before it. "Pathetic," the officer sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look at you, always whining about equality, about rights. But you can't even pick yourself up off the ground. You really think people like you deserve to walk free? People like you should be grateful for any little thing they get. You think you're special? You're not. You're nothing." Jamal's chest tightened, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to make the officer feel the weight of his hate, but the words were trapped inside him. They were drowned out by the voices in his head. The voices of every cruel word, every insult, every time he had been made to feel less than human. But then, in the midst of it all, something snapped inside him. He wasn't sure where the strength came from, but suddenly, Jamal pushed himself up with all the power he had left. His arms shook, his body screamed in protest, but he rose. His knees buckled beneath him, but he didn't fall. The officer took a step back, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "Look at you, trying to stand up like you're something, like you have the right to be here with the rest of us." Jamal's hands trembled, and his breath was shallow, but he stood his ground. The world around him blurred, and for a moment, it was just him and the officer, just the two of them, locked in this sick, twisted dance. "You think you can humiliate me and get away with it?" Jamal's voice was low, but there was a strength behind it that surprised even him. "You're wrong. You don't get to do this to me." The officer's eyes narrowed, his smile fading. For a brief moment, Jamal thought he saw a flicker of something in the officer's gaze, something like doubt, or maybe even fear. But it vanished quickly, replaced by that same ugly sneer. "You want to stand up to me, huh?" The officer's voice was thick with mockery. "What are you going to do? Cry about it. That's all you people do. Cry, beg for sympathy, demand things you don't deserve. You think anyone's going to listen to your side? No one cares about you." Jamal clenched his fists, feeling his nails dig into his palms. The pain helped him focus. He didn't care what the officer said anymore. He didn't care what the bystanders thought. All he cared about was that he was still standing, still breathing, still alive. He could hear the bus pulling up in the distance, but it didn't matter. The officer's words, the crowd's indifference, it didn't matter anymore. "Get on the damn bus," the officer spat, his hand reaching for Jamal's shoulder again, this time with intent to shove him back down. But Jamal wasn't having it. With a swift movement, he jerked away, stepping back, forcing himself to balance on his crutches. The officer's hand missed its target, and for a second, Jamal thought he saw the officer's composure crack. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. "You want to see how low I can go?" Jamal's voice was quieter now, but it was steady. "You think I don't know what's going on in your head? You're just another man who's been told he's better than me, just because of the color of my skin. But you can't break me. You can't break me down anymore. Not today." The officer's jaw tightened. His face twisted into a mask of rage. He took a step forward, his hands balled into fists. But before he could move closer, the sound of a camera shutter clicked. Jamal froze. His eyes shifted to the side, and his heart skipped a beat. There, standing a few feet away, was a woman with a camera. Her lens pointed directly at them. She hadn't said a word, hadn't moved since the confrontation had started, but her presence was unmistakable. She had been recording everything. The officer's eyes flicked to her, his face pale. The shift in his demeanor was instant, a flash of panic in his eyes. But it was too late. The damage had been done. What had been captured in that moment couldn't be undone. Jamal's chest swelled with a mixture of relief and dread. He knew it wasn't over, that it would only get worse before it got better. But for now, the officer's grip on him, on the situation, was slipping. And Jamal knew this. He wasn't going to be the one who disappeared into silence again. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Now, let's continue. The sound of the camera shutter was like a crack in the silence, sharp and jarring. The officer froze for a moment, as if the reality of being exposed had hit him like a physical blow. His eyes darted toward the woman with the camera, then back at Jamal, who could feel the anger and panic brewing in the officer's gaze. For a split second, there was a shift, an unspoken realization that the power dynamic had changed. Jamal wasn't just some helpless kid anymore. He wasn't the invisible target he'd been moments before. The world was watching, and that made all the difference. The officer took a step back, his hands trembling ever so slightly. Jamal noticed it, and a surge of something close to strength, began to build in him. The officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. He was no longer the authority in the situation. He was just a man, just a person who had been caught in a moment of brutal, unrepentant cruelty. "You think I care about your little camera?" The officer finally spoke, his voice low and venomous, but with an edge of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. He was trying to regain control, trying to twist the narrative back in his favor, but the words sounded hollow now, like a man trying to convince himself of something he no longer believed. The woman with the camera didn't flinch. Her eyes were steady, focused. She hadn't moved since she started recording, and it was clear to everyone that she wasn't going anywhere. Jamal could feel the weight of her gaze too, like a beacon of justice, even if it wasn't yet clear what would come of this moment. Her presence was like a shield, a quiet defiance against the officer's unchecked power. The camera was more than just a lens. It was a weapon now, a tool that could strip away the officer's authority, expose him for the coward he was. "You're going to regret this," the officer muttered, his voice losing some of its confidence. "You think this changes anything? People like you, people like him, are always looking for a reason to play the victim. I don't care what you think you've got on film. You think the world will care." Jamal could feel his heart pounding. His mind raced. The officer's words were a constant stream of abuse, but now they were tinged with something else. Fear. The officer was afraid, and for the first time, Jamal realized that maybe, just maybe, he had the upper hand. The balance of power was shifting, but the officer wasn't finished. With a swift, deliberate motion, he grabbed Jamal by the arm, yanking him toward the curb with a violent jerk. The crowd around them seemed to shrink further, as if shrinking away from the reality of what was happening. Some turned their heads. Others looked down, pretending not to see. The indifference was suffocating. "You're not better than me," the officer spat, his face twisted in anger. "You think you've got something over me now? I'm the one with the power. I'm the one who decides what happens here." Jamal's arm burned where the officer's fingers gripped him, but this time Jamal didn't flinch. He didn't shrink away. His gaze didn't waver from the officer's eyes. The fear was still there, gnawing at him, but it was fading, replaced with something far stronger. He could feel the camera still on him, could feel the eyes of the woman, and that of every stranger who had been unwilling to help before, but was now, in a sense, a silent witness to what was happening. The officer's grip tightened, but Jamal knew now that it wasn't just about physical force. It was about control. He was trying to force Jamal into submission, to remind him of his place. But Jamal wasn't going to let it happen. Not anymore. "I'm not the one who needs to be afraid," Jamal said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "You're the one who's afraid of the truth." The officer's face contorted in rage. He raised his hand as if to strike Jamal, but then hesitated, as if the weight of the camera on him was too much to ignore. For a brief moment, the officer wavered, looking around as if seeking support from the crowd, but no one moved. The silence from the onlookers was deafening. No one stepped in to stop him, but no one stepped forward to defend him either. In that instant, Jamal understood the brutal truth about the world around him. It wasn't just about the officer, it was about the system, the silent approval of the crowd, the way society had conditioned people to turn away from injustice until it became too loud to ignore. But now, it was loud. It was undeniable. And even if no one stepped forward, they were all witnesses to what was happening. The officer lowered his hand slowly, his fingers twitching in frustration. He stepped back, releasing Jamal's arm, but the tension didn't leave. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as if it was waiting for something to break. "I don't need your pity," the officer muttered, turning his back on Jamal, as if trying to walk away from the truth. "But when this blows over, you won't matter. You'll go back to your corner, and I'll still be the one in control." Jamal stood there, holding his ground, the pain in his legs forgotten for a moment. He didn't need the officer's validation. He didn't need anyone's pity. For the first time, he realized that his worth wasn't defined by the officer's opinion or the crowd's silence. His worth wasn't something that could be taken away by a uniform or a badge. As the officer walked away, Jamal's breath came more steadily, but the anger, the frustration, the years of pent-up rage still simmered inside him. The camera was still on him, but for a moment, Jamal didn't care. He had made it through. He had stood up, and that, in this moment, was all that mattered. The bus arrived at the stop, its doors opening with a soft hiss. Jamal turned, crutches in hand, and took a step forward, his body moving with a renewed sense of purpose. The world was still broken, still unfair, but today, just for a moment, he had taken control. Jamal's crutches echoed against the cold concrete as he made his way toward the bus. The crowd around him seemed to part, like water flowing around a stone. Some of the people at the stop were still watching him, their eyes a mixture of curiosity and something darker, something Jamal couldn't quite place but felt deep in his bones. It wasn't the kind of gaze you'd expect from a stranger who cared about your well-being. No, this was the look of someone who had watched a fight unfold from the sidelines. Someone who felt a strange sense of guilt but was too afraid to take action. Jamal could feel the heat of their eyes burning into his back, but he refused to turn around. He had learned long ago that the world wasn't going to help him. The world was always too busy, too wrapped up in its own indifference, and so he had learned to stand alone, to be invisible if it meant surviving another day, in a world that only saw him as something less than human. As he stepped onto the bus, he felt the familiar tension that always settled in his chest when he entered a crowded public space. People moved aside, shifting their bodies to give him room, but their eyes didn't leave him. There was always this invisible barrier between Jamal and everyone else, a wall built from years of oppression, from the moments when he had been treated like a shadow, a ghost, something that wasn't really supposed to be there. But Jamal had long stopped caring about what people thought of him. He had learned that it didn't matter, not in the grand scheme of things. It didn't matter whether they hated him or felt pity for him, because in the end, they would all move on. They would all forget him. And that's what scared him most. The silence, the forgetfulness. The bus doors shut behind him with a low hiss, and he moved toward an empty seat at the back, dragging his crutches along the aisle. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him as he walked, but he didn't look up. Not this time. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. Not after everything he had just endured. As Jamal sat down, the bus lurched forward, its engine roaring to life. He leaned back in his seat, his body exhausted from the tension, from the violence, from the humiliation. His legs were sore, and his arms ached from the effort of holding his crutches. But it wasn't the physical pain that hurt the most. It was the memory of the officer's face, the way he had looked at Jamal, like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. The words still echoed in Jamal's mind. Pathetic, worthless, you don't deserve to be here. Those words weren't just the officers. They were the words of society, of a system that had decided, long before Jamal was even born, that people like him didn't belong. That people like him weren't meant to stand on the same ground as everyone else. As the bus rumbled down the street, Jamal stared out the window, watching the world pass by in a blur. The faces of the people outside were just like those inside the bus, indifferent, unaware, too busy with their own lives to care about anything that didn't directly affect them. But Jamal wasn't surprised. He had seen it all before. He had learned to accept it, to live with it. But something was different today. He could feel it. The weight of the officer's anger, the sting of his words, still hung in the air like a bad smell. But there was something else now, something that had been awakened in Jamal. A fire he didn't know he had. Jamal had spent his whole life letting people walk all over him. He had learned to keep his head down, to keep his mouth shut, to avoid conflict. He had learned that the world was a cruel place, and the only way to survive was to stay out of its way. But the officer had shown him something. The officer had given him a glimpse into the ugliness of the world, the raw, unfiltered hatred that simmered just beneath the surface. And that glimpse had changed something in Jamal. He wasn't going to be silent anymore. The sound of a phone ringing broke through Jamal's thoughts. He glanced around the bus, looking for the source of the noise. It was coming from a woman sitting a few rows ahead of him. She had her head down, staring at her phone screen, her finger swiping through something. Jamal didn't think much of it at first. People were always on their phones, always distracted by the small, bright screens that seemed to be the only things that mattered in the world. But then he heard her voice, and it was enough to freeze him in his seat. "I can't believe this shit," the woman muttered, her voice loud enough for Jamal to hear. Just another black guy trying to make trouble, probably. Jamal's stomach dropped, his heart racing as her words sliced through him like a knife. The woman's voice was laced with disgust, with a venom that felt all too familiar. She wasn't just talking about what had happened earlier. No, she was talking about him, about people like him. The words hung in the air, suffocating him. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to stand up, to shout at her, to tell her she was wrong, but his body froze. The woman wasn't even looking at him. She was still staring at her phone, oblivious to the damage she was doing with every word she spoke. Jamal clenched his fists in his lap, his nails digging into his palms. The rage was building inside him, a slow burn that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the woman's words that hurt. It was everything. The years of being told he was less than human. The years of being looked at like an inconvenience, like a problem that needed to be dealt with. It was the years of silence from the people who watched and did nothing. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as he fought to keep his anger in check. But it wasn't enough. The pressure was too much. His mind was spinning, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't take it anymore. With a sudden, violent motion, Jamal stood up, his crutches clattering to the floor. His body felt like it was on fire, his legs trembling with the effort to keep him steady. The woman looked up, startled, but before she could say anything, Jamal spoke. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he said, his voice hoarse but full of conviction. "You don't know anything about what I've been through, about what people like me have to deal with every single day. You think you can just sit there and judge me? You think you can talk about me like I'm some kind of animal? You think I don't hear you?" The bus had gone silent. Every passenger was watching him now, their eyes wide with shock, with curiosity, with fear. Jamal didn't care. He wasn't going to back down. Not anymore. The woman opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was taken aback by his outburst, by the raw intensity in his voice. But Jamal wasn't done. "You think I'm just a statistic. You think I'm just some stereotype you can laugh at and forget about. But I'm not. I'm not a joke. I'm a person, just like you. And if you can't see that, then you're just as bad as the people who've been treating me like shit my whole life." The woman's face turned red, and she looked around, clearly uncomfortable. But no one spoke up. No one defended her. No one stepped forward to stop Jamal. For the first time in his life, Jamal felt something he hadn't known he was missing. Power. He looked at the woman one last time, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Next time you open your mouth, think about who you're talking to, because I won't sit back and let you tear me down anymore." He turned and made his way to the back of the bus, his crutches scraping against the floor. As he sat down, he could feel the eyes of everyone on him. But this time, it didn't matter. He had spoken his truth, and in this moment, that was enough. The bus continued its journey, but Jamal wasn't thinking about the destination. He wasn't thinking about the world outside. He was thinking about the future. A future where he didn't have to shrink back. A future where he didn't have to be afraid of the world, where he didn't have to be afraid of people who saw him as less than human. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Jamal felt like he was finally on the right path. The bus pulled away from the curb, its engine humming steadily as Jamal sat silently at the back, his mind a tangled web of thoughts, anger, and frustration. His body still felt the burn from the altercation, the adrenaline that had surged through him only moments ago. But now, as the initial wave of emotion subsided, he could feel it all. The ache in his legs, the weight of the day's events, the crushing pressure of being constantly reminded that he was other in a world that barely seemed to care. The woman on the bus, the one who had so casually disparaged him, was still sitting near the front. She hadn't said a word since Jamal had spoken out, but Jamal could feel her eyes on him. He wasn't sure what she was thinking. Was she ashamed, guilty? Or was she simply angry at being called out? It didn't matter. Jamal knew that people like her, people who had been conditioned to believe in their own superiority, didn't change overnight. They didn't wake up one morning and suddenly see the world differently. They didn't understand the pain they caused, the way their words had the power to destroy someone from the inside out. The bus ride stretched on, each passing street a reminder of the world Jamal lived in. A world where his very existence was an anomaly, a threat to people who couldn't fathom life beyond their own privilege. And it was the silence that haunted him the most. The silence that followed every moment of injustice. The silence that filled the spaces where compassion and action should have been. The silence from the people around him. The ones who had witnessed everything but had done nothing. The ones who had been complicit in the system that treated him like a second-class citizen. As the bus moved through the city, Jamal's thoughts drifted to the officer from earlier. He couldn't stop thinking about the look on his face. The officer's eyes filled with hatred and contempt, as though Jamal's very presence was an insult. He had called him names, belittled him, shoved him to the ground, and yet somehow, it was Jamal who was left with the burden of that encounter. The officer would walk away, likely with no consequence, while Jamal would carry the weight of that violence with him forever. But something had shifted in Jamal. The fear that had always kept him in line, that had kept him quiet and compliant, was slowly starting to fade. He wasn't going to let this go. Not anymore. The officer had shown him the depth of the hatred that still thrived in the world, but he had also shown Jamal that it was possible to stand up, to push back, to demand respect, even if the world didn't want to give it. As the bus pulled into the next stop, Jamal heard the faint sound of a phone ringing. He didn't turn to look, but the voice that followed was unmistakable. It was the same woman who had spoken earlier, the one who had referred to him as just another black guy trying to make trouble. "I swear," she said, her voice laced with disdain, "I'm so sick of these people, always looking for a reason to play the victim, always making a scene. It's not like I did anything to him. He just doesn't know his place." The words hit Jamal like a slap in the face. He felt his blood boil, his muscles tense with the urge to confront her again. But this time, he didn't react immediately. He sat there, gripping his crutches, the anger swirling inside him. But he forced himself to stay calm. It wasn't just her, it was the whole system. The way people like her were taught to view people like him. They had been conditioned to believe that their privilege was a birthright, that the world owed them something just because of the color of their skin. They didn't see him as a person. They saw him as a threat, as a problem that needed to be controlled. The silence on the bus was suffocating. No one spoke up. No one said a word in Jamal's defense. The other passengers avoided eye contact, pretending they couldn't hear the woman's words, pretending they didn't see what was happening. But Jamal could feel it. He could feel the weight of their indifference pressing down on him, suffocating him. "Why don't you just shut up?" Jamal said suddenly, his voice cold and steady. The woman froze. For a moment, Jamal thought she might ignore him, might continue with her toxic rant as if he weren't there. But instead, she looked up, meeting his gaze. There was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, followed by a flash of anger. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "Who do you think you are, talking to me like that?" "I think I'm the guy you just called a victim," Jamal replied, his voice rising slightly. "And I think I've had enough of your bullshit." The woman's expression darkened. She stood up, taking a step toward him, her eyes filled with hostility. "You don't know anything about me," she spat. "You don't know what it's like to work hard for everything you have. You think just because you're black and disabled, you get to act like the world owes you something. You don't deserve my respect. You don't deserve anyone's respect." Jamal's heart raced, but he held his ground. "You think I want your respect?" he said, his voice now filled with the weight of years of oppression, of hate, of being told that he wasn't good enough. "I don't need it. I don't need anyone's pity. But you know what? You owe me basic decency. You owe me the same respect you give to everyone else. But you're too wrapped up in your own privilege to see it." The woman scoffed, taking another step closer. "You don't even know what respect is. You're just a burden on society. People like you are always looking for a handout, always playing the victim. You think anyone cares about your sob story?" Jamal felt the heat rising in his chest, the anger building inside him, but he kept his focus. "You don't get it. You'll never get it. You'll never understand what it's like to walk through the world and have everyone look at you like you don't belong, to have people treat you like you're less than human just because of the color of your skin. You'll never understand that because you've never had to. You've never been told that you don't matter, that you're not worth anything. You don't know what it's like to have to fight for every inch of respect you get." There was a pause. For a moment, it seemed like the woman might say something more, but the words were caught in her throat. Jamal could see the struggle in her eyes, the conflict between her ingrained beliefs and the reality of what he was saying. It was a rare moment of doubt, of self-awareness, and Jamal didn't let it slip away. "You think I'm making a scene?" Jamal continued. "You think I'm playing the victim? I'm not. I'm standing up for myself, for every person who's ever been treated like they don't matter. And if you can't see that, if you can't see the humanity in me, then you're the one who's part of the problem." The woman didn't say anything. She turned and walked away. But Jamal didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt empty. He had spoken the truth, but the weight of it hung heavy in the air, pressing down on him like 1,000 tons of stone. As the bus continued on its route, Jamal's mind was spinning. What had he just done? What had he accomplished? The world hadn't changed. The woman hadn't apologized. The officer hadn't faced any consequences for his actions, and Jamal was still the same. Still black, still disabled, still forced to live in a world that treated him as less than. But something had shifted. He had spoken his truth. He had demanded respect, and for the first time, Jamal felt like he wasn't invisible. He wasn't just a victim. He wasn't just another statistic. He was a person, and he wasn't going to let anyone forget it. The bus came to a stop, and Jamal stood up. His crutches felt heavier now, but his body moved with a new sense of purpose. As he stepped off the bus and into the world, he didn't look back. The battle was far from over, but Jamal knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to lose this fight. Not now. Not ever. Jamal stepped off the bus, his crutches tapping against the pavement with each determined stride. The familiar weight of them pressed into his palms, a constant reminder of his limitations, but also his strength. Every step, every movement was a battle, a silent act of defiance against a world that had never wanted him to succeed, a world that had always tried to hold him back. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets as Jamal made his way through the city. The cool evening air seemed to carry with it the remnants of the confrontation on the bus. The anger, the tension, and the quiet, seething frustration that he couldn't seem to shake. It had been hours since he had stood up to the woman on the bus, but the moment was still fresh in his mind. He could hear her voice, her venomous words echoing in his ears. But what lingered longer was the silence that followed. The silence from the people around him, the ones who had watched him struggle, who had heard the woman's cruel words, but did nothing. It was the same silence he had encountered countless times before, the silence that allowed the hatred to fester, to grow unchecked. But Jamal had spoken up. He had finally broken through the silence, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just another victim in a long line of faceless, forgotten people. He had made himself heard. But even as the thought settled in his mind, another one emerged. What had changed? He had stood up to the woman, but she had walked away without a second thought. The officer who had pushed him to the ground earlier that day would continue to wear his badge, would continue to patrol the streets, probably without ever facing any real consequences. The world hadn't stopped turning. People hadn't stopped ignoring the pain of those who were oppressed. It wasn't just about one incident. It was about the system that allowed it to happen over and over again. The world was built on these systems of control, and it was hard not to feel like an individual act of defiance wouldn't be enough to change anything. Jamal's crutches clicked on the sidewalk as he moved forward, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He passed by the familiar faces of the people who lived in his neighborhood, people who had seen it all before. The glances, the looks of judgment, the fear, they were all too familiar. He didn't look back at them. He didn't need to. He had seen enough of it in his life to know what they thought. He had been taught early on that his worth was measured by the color of his skin, by his disability, by everything about him that was different from the norm. He had been born into a world that had already decided who he was, a world that had already placed its limits on him, already determined that he would never be more than what they saw on the surface. But today, Jamal had done something that none of them expected. He had spoken out. He had faced the worst of it and survived. He had challenged the idea that he was lesser, that he was invisible. He had made himself seen, but as he turned the corner onto his street, the harsh reality of his life settled back in. It wasn't just the people on the bus. It wasn't just the officer. It was everyone. Every glance, every slight, every moment where he was made to feel that he didn't belong, that he was a burden. It was the small things, the things that didn't seem like much at first. The way people looked at him when they thought he wasn't paying attention. The way they looked away when he caught their gaze. The way they spoke to him, with pity in their voices, as though he were a charity case. It was those moments that wore him down, the quiet erosion of his dignity, piece by piece. He had spent his whole life fighting to be seen, fighting to be treated like a human being, but it felt like the world was always one step ahead. It felt like for every small victory, there were 10 more insults waiting around the corner. Jamal arrived at his building, his legs aching from the long walk, his mind still racing. He pushed open the door to the lobby, the smell of stale air and burnt coffee greeting him as he entered. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an unnatural glow over the sterile, worn-down space. It was the kind of place people lived when they had nowhere else to go. It wasn't much, but it was home. Home in the way that only a place could be when it was the only option left. He walked toward the elevator, the creak of the old metal doors echoing in the otherwise silent lobby. As he waited for the elevator to arrive, Jamal glanced around, his eyes landing on the other tenants in the building. There was the old man who always sat in the corner, staring at the floor. There was the young mother with her child, the child who had a nervous look in his eyes as he held onto her hand. Jamal could see it all. The fear, the resignation, the quiet acceptance of a life that was never meant to be anything more than a struggle for survival. He wondered if they saw it too, the way the world had been built to keep people like him, people who didn't fit the mold, in their place. It was a silent agreement, an unwritten rule that said some people didn't matter, that some people were never going to make it. But Jamal wasn't going to let himself be one of those people. Not anymore. The elevator doors opened and Jamal stepped inside. As the doors closed behind him, he leaned against the wall, his thoughts swirling. He thought about what had happened earlier that day, about the officer and the woman, about the people on the bus who had turned their heads and pretended not to see. He thought about the world that had shaped him, that had tried to define him, and he felt the anger bubbling up again. But there was something else in him now, something he hadn't felt before. It wasn't just anger, it was determination. It was a desire to fight back, to demand what was rightfully his. He had been given a glimpse of the world's cruelty, and he had fought against it. But it wasn't enough. He couldn't just fight for himself. He couldn't just fight for the moment. He had to fight for something bigger. The elevator dinged as it reached his floor, and Jamal stepped out, his crutches tapping against the worn tiles of the hallway. He made his way to his apartment, his fingers brushing against the walls as he walked. When he reached the door, he stopped for a moment, resting his hand on the doorknob. The world outside was cold, unforgiving, but here, inside these walls, he had a fleeting sense of peace. Here, he could be himself, away from the stares and the whispers, away from the racism and the hate. He opened the door and stepped inside. The apartment was small, cluttered with the remnants of his life. Old books, scattered papers, an overturned cup on the coffee table. But it was his, and for now, that was enough. Jamal sat down on the couch, letting the weight of the day settle into his bones. His mind was racing again, the events of the day playing over and over in his head. He had stood up to the officer, to the woman on the bus, to the system that had tried to crush him. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough until things changed, until the world saw people like him for who they truly were. Not just a label, not just a stereotype. But how did you change the world? How did you fight a system that was so ingrained, so deeply rooted in hatred, that it seemed impossible to break? The questions were overwhelming, suffocating. But Jamal had no answers, only the knowledge that he wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to let the world define him anymore. He would keep fighting, even if it meant standing alone, even if it meant enduring the pain and humiliation, the racism and the ignorance, over and over again. He would stand up. He would make himself heard. And one day, the world would have to listen. For now, though, he sat in the quiet of his apartment, allowing himself a moment of rest. Tomorrow, the fight would begin again. But tonight, he was still standing. Jamal woke to the sound of his alarm buzzing relentlessly. The early morning light filtered in through the window, casting long, thin shadows across the room. It was a new day, but it felt like nothing had changed. The weight of the previous day's encounters still hung on him, the feeling of being pushed to the edge of his endurance, yet still standing firm. He hadn't been able to shake the anger that had followed him home, the sense that he was constantly at war with a world that saw him as less than, a world that viewed his existence as a threat simply because of the skin he was born into. He sat up in bed, his legs aching from the long walk home, his mind buzzing with memories of the confrontation on the bus, of the officer who had shoved him down and told him he didn't belong, the woman's words, the indifference of the passengers, the way the system had allowed it all to unfold. It was all a reminder that his fight was far from over. The truth was, Jamal was tired. He was exhausted from having to explain himself over and over again, from having to prove that he was worthy of the same rights and respect that others took for granted. He was tired of being treated like he was invisible, of being dismissed as just another statistic. But despite the exhaustion, he knew he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the world continue to silence him, continue to break him down piece by piece. He wasn't going to let it win. Jamal got out of bed, his crutches resting against the wall. He could feel the heaviness of the air around him, the pressure that seemed to follow him wherever he went. It was a feeling he had known all his life, the pressure to fit in, to be normal, to conform to a world that was built for people who didn't look like him. He had spent years trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to remind him that he didn't belong. But today, something felt different. Jamal could feel it in the pit of his stomach. A shift, a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. He had been a passenger in his own life for far too long. Now, he was ready to take the wheel. He couldn't keep waiting for someone else to change the world for him. He couldn't keep relying on other people to fight his battles. The fight had to be his. He dressed quickly, the weight of his clothes feeling like armor as he prepared to face the day. He strapped his crutches under his arms and looked at himself in the mirror. For the first time in a long while, he didn't see the boy who had been beaten down by the world. He didn't see the child who had learned to accept the cruelties of life as just a part of the journey. Today, he saw a man who had been tested and broken, but still refused to be beaten. The streets outside were alive with the usual hum of the city, the noise of cars, buses, and pedestrians blending into a cacophony of sound. Jamal stepped onto the sidewalk, taking in the familiar sights of the neighborhood. It was the same as always. People rushing to their destinations, cars honking, the usual mess of city life. But for Jamal, it felt different today. Every face he passed, every person who looked at him with indifference, every person who didn't see the struggle he faced just by existing, felt like a reminder of the battle he was in. The battle that had no end, that was fought every day, every hour, with every glance and every comment. He made his way toward the bus stop, the one he had been to countless times before. But this time, he didn't feel like he was walking into a trap. This time, he wasn't going to let the world define him. He wasn't going to shrink into the background, letting the constant stream of racism and prejudice wash over him. He wasn't going to let people walk all over him anymore. As he approached the bus stop, his eyes scanned the crowd. There were the usual faces, people going about their day, not noticing the young man with the crutches who stood among them, not realizing that he was a person with dreams, with hopes, with the same desire for dignity and respect as anyone else. But today, Jamal wasn't going to let them ignore him. He wasn't going to let them look through him as if he were invisible. He took a deep breath, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He had no idea what the day would bring, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let it pass without making his voice heard. The bus pulled up to the stop, and as it screeched to a halt, Jamal stepped forward. He was acutely aware of the eyes on him, the way the people at the stop shifted uncomfortably as he walked past. He could feel their eyes on him, the subtle glances, the avoidance, the way they tried not to acknowledge him. It was the same as always, but then something unexpected happened. As Jamal climbed onto the bus, he noticed a young man standing near the front, a man he had seen a few times before. The man looked at Jamal, and instead of averting his eyes, he gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. It was subtle, but it was enough. Jamal felt a flicker of recognition. This man didn't look at him as a victim, as something to pity. He looked at him as a person. And in that moment, Jamal felt the tiniest spark of hope. He took a seat at the back of the bus, his crutches resting in front of him. The bus filled with the usual mix of passengers, some chattering amongst themselves, others lost in their phones. The hum of the engine drowned out most of the noise, but Jamal's thoughts were still racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the officer, the way the man had shoved him, the way the world had let it happen. The officer had been a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, a reminder of how people like Jamal were treated as disposable. But the officer wasn't the only one to blame. It was the system that had allowed him to act with impunity, the system that had given him the power to humiliate and dehumanize Jamal without fear of consequence. Jamal's grip on his crutches tightened as he thought about the woman on the bus the day before, her words still echoing in his ears. "You don't know your place." The words were cruel, but they were nothing new. Jamal had heard them his whole life, from people who didn't see him as human, from people who were too caught up in their own lives to care about the injustice that surrounded them. But this time, Jamal wasn't going to let it slide. This time, he wasn't going to keep quiet. He had been silent for too long. The world wasn't going to change unless he spoke up, unless he demanded that people see him for who he was. He wasn't going to let them strip him of his humanity any longer. The bus reached the next stop, and the doors opened with a hiss. A group of people got on, one of them an older woman, who shuffled to the seat beside Jamal. She glanced at him, her eyes lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Jamal could feel her judgment, could feel the subtle way she was measuring him, deciding whether or not he was worth her time. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, her voice cold but polite. Jamal nodded, shifting slightly to make room for her. As she sat down, he could feel her eyes on him, studying him. He knew what she was thinking. She was probably wondering why someone like him was out in the world, why he was taking up space. People like her never understood. They never saw the struggle, never saw the weight of the world that hung over people like him. The woman adjusted her purse, and for a moment, Jamal wondered if she was going to say something. He wondered if she would speak the words that were always lingering on the tip of everyone's tongue. "Why don't you just stay out of our way?" But she didn't. She just stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the passing streets, as if he didn't even exist. Jamal leaned back in his seat, his mind still churning with thoughts of the world outside. He wasn't going to let the world silence him. He wasn't going to let people like her get away with their prejudice and indifference. As the bus continued its journey, Jamal thought about what had happened in the past week. The confrontation on the bus, the way the officer had treated him, the woman's words. He thought about the people who had watched, who had done nothing, and he realized something. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about one person standing up to the system. It was about the people who were too afraid to speak up, too afraid to confront the ugliness they saw around them. The world wouldn't change if everyone stayed silent. The world wouldn't change if everyone just accepted things as they were. Jamal had started a fire, and he wasn't going to let it burn out. Not now, not ever. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been pushed to the margins. He was fighting for the future, for the world that would one day look back at this moment and realize that things had changed. And as the bus moved through the streets, Jamal knew one thing for sure. The fight had just begun. Jamal had always believed that silence was the weapon of the oppressor. The people who stood by, watched, and said nothing were just as guilty as those who threw the punches, who delivered the insults. He had spent too many years believing that if he kept his head down, if he just stayed out of the way, he could avoid the ugliness of the world. But what had that gotten him? Nothing but an existence that felt like a shadow, always present, but never fully seen. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just his fight. It never had been. He was a part of something much larger, a machine built on centuries of prejudice, of inequality, of dehumanization. But now, he was tired of being a cog in that machine. He was tired of being invisible, of being told that he didn't matter, of being forced to live under the weight of a system that never wanted him to succeed. That day on the bus, when he had stood up to the woman, when he had spoken the truth that had been buried inside him for so long, he had felt something shift. He had felt the stirrings of something larger than himself, something that could not be contained. The small victories, the moments of standing up, had given him a taste of what it meant to fight back, to claim his space in the world. But even as he stood on the edge of something bigger, the storm was already gathering. The next day, when Jamal stepped out of his apartment building, he felt it in the air. The world felt heavy, charged with the kind of tension that preceded a downpour. He had no way of knowing what would happen, but his instincts told him that everything was about to change. It had been a few days since the altercation on the bus, and Jamal could feel the ripples of that moment spreading outwards. The incident had been small, just a few words exchanged, just a brief confrontation. But to Jamal, it felt like it was more than that. He was no longer just one person trying to survive. He was a symbol. He was the embodiment of a struggle that had lasted for generations. He had received a call earlier that morning from a local reporter who had been following the story. The footage from the bus had gone viral, and Jamal had become a face of something bigger, a movement, a voice for those who had long been silenced. The reporter had told him that the police department was aware of the video, and they were preparing a statement. It wasn't hard to guess what that statement would say. It was always the same, wasn't it? The officer would be cleared, and Jamal's struggle would be brushed aside as an isolated incident. But Jamal wasn't going to let them get away with it. He wasn't going to be silenced, not this time. He couldn't afford to be. As he walked down the street, he passed the usual faces, people who had seen him every day for years, but had never really seen him at all. Their eyes would flick over him, but never linger. They didn't want to acknowledge him, didn't want to see what he represented. He wasn't just a man with crutches. He wasn't just a person struggling to survive. To them, he was just another problem to ignore. But Jamal wasn't interested in being ignored anymore. He wasn't going to let the world look past him. He wasn't going to let them treat him like a ghost. He turned the corner and made his way toward the small park, where he often went to sit and clear his mind. It was quiet there, away from the noise of the city, but it was also a place where he could be alone with his thoughts. And today, more than ever, he needed that solitude. He needed to think about what he was going to do next. The park was almost empty, save for a few elderly people walking their dogs, but Jamal didn't care. He took a seat on one of the benches, his crutches resting beside him, and leaned back, staring up at the sky. The clouds were darkening, gathering in ominous shapes, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something big, and then it happened. A group of men appeared out of nowhere, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Jamal hadn't noticed them at first, but now they were circling him, their eyes locked onto him as if he were prey. There were 3 of them, all tall, all broad-shouldered, all wearing the same arrogant sneers on their faces. They were strangers to Jamal, but he could tell by the way they carried themselves that they didn't belong here. They were the kind of men who made people uncomfortable, the kind of men who thrived on intimidation. Jamal's heart began to race. He could feel the tension in the air, the way the space between them shrank with each passing second. They had seen him, seen the video, heard the story, and now they were here to remind him of his place. They were here to remind him that no matter how much he fought, no matter how much he stood up for himself, he would always be less than them. One of the men stepped forward, his eyes glinting with malice. He was wearing a black leather jacket, his hair shaved close to his scalp. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look who it is, the little hero from the bus. What, you think you're special now?" Jamal gripped his crutches tighter, trying to keep his breathing steady. He had been in situations like this before, situations where people tried to intimidate him, tried to make him feel small, but today was different. Today, he wasn't afraid. The man sneered, stepping even closer. "What, you think just because you stood up to a woman on a bus, you're some kind of warrior? You think the world owes you something?" Jamal stood up slowly, forcing his legs to carry him, despite the sharp pain in his joints. His crutches clicked against the pavement as he steadied himself. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. "I don't need the world to owe me anything," Jamal said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm just asking for the respect I deserve, the respect that every human being deserves." The man laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Respect? You think you deserve respect?" He stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "You don't deserve respect. You're just another nobody who thinks he's important. You're just a reminder of what's wrong with this place." Jamal could feel the anger boiling up inside him, but he kept his cool. He wasn't going to let this man provoke him into a fight. He had fought long enough, and he wasn't going to be dragged back into that world of violence and hate. "You don't know anything about me," Jamal said, his voice cold. "You don't know what it's like to walk through life with people like you thinking you're less than them. You don't know what it's like to have your worth decided for you the moment you're born. So don't stand there and act like you know what respect is." The man's eyes flashed with fury. "I know exactly what respect is, boy," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "And you don't deserve it." Jamal's mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was coming. He had always known it. The world wasn't going to change just because he stood up for himself. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The man took a step forward, raising his fist. Jamal didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. But just before the punch could land, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out from the park entrance. "Hey, leave him alone." Jamal's head snapped to the side, his eyes widening in surprise. The voice came from the man he had seen earlier that morning, the one who had given him that nod of recognition. He was standing a few feet away, his stance wide, his body tensed, ready to step in if things went any further. The man in the leather jacket turned, his expression darkening. "And who the hell are you?" "I'm someone who's tired of people like you," the man said, his voice low but forceful. "Tired of people who think they can bully others just because they're different. You're not going to do this here." For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension in the air palpable. Jamal could feel his chest tightening, the weight of the situation settling in. But then, the man in the leather jacket scoffed, shaking his head. "Whatever," he muttered. "This isn't over." He turned and walked away, his two companions following him, their footsteps fading into the distance. Jamal exhaled slowly, his heart still pounding. He looked at the man who had intervened, unsure of what to say. "Thanks," Jamal said quietly. "I didn't expect that." The man gave him a small, almost reluctant smile. "You don't have to thank me. It's just, I'm tired of seeing this shit too." Jamal looked at him, the realization settling in. The world wasn't just full of people who wanted to bring him down. There were others, people who had seen the same ugliness, who had felt the same pain, and maybe, just maybe, they were ready to stand with him. The storm wasn't over, but it was starting to rain, and Jamal felt, for the first time in his life, that he wasn't alone. The days after the confrontation in the park seemed to stretch out in ways that Jamal couldn't quite explain. Every morning, when the sun rose and the city's hum began to stir, he felt like he was living on the edge of something monumental. The air felt thicker, charged with a sense of purpose, but also with something darker, something that made every step feel heavier than the last. He had never truly believed that his actions could cause real change. But now, after that brief moment of defiance, the intervention of the stranger, the deflating of the threat, it felt like something had shifted. Jamal had taken a small step forward, but there was a ripple effect, and he wasn't the only one who felt it. The world hadn't changed overnight. He knew that. Racism was still rampant. Discrimination was still embedded in every corner of society, and the system would continue to grind away at people like him. But in the hours after the park, Jamal had heard things. People had talked, whispers and murmurs on the street, in the local stores, even online. The video from the bus had gone viral. People had seen it. People had heard his words, seen him stand up for himself. Jamal's face was now more widely recognized, but so were the issues he'd been confronting. There were stories, small movements beginning to form around his name, but it wasn't just him. He wasn't alone anymore. Yet the quiet was still suffocating. The silence of those who turned away, who said nothing. They were the ones who continued to support the system. The silence of those who would never stand in the way of their own privilege. Jamal could feel the weight of their gaze, the unspoken judgments, the internalized hate that some people wore like a badge. There was a shift in the air, yes, but that shift didn't mean the battle was over. One day, as he walked to the corner store for some essentials, Jamal was confronted by a familiar figure, a face he knew well. Officer Reynolds, the officer who had pushed him to the ground that fateful day at the bus stop, the man who had seen Jamal as an obstacle, a lesser being. Jamal had avoided him since that day, but now, here he was, standing on the same sidewalk, his imposing figure blocking Jamal's path. At first, Jamal felt the instinctual wave of panic, his heart hammering in his chest, his thoughts rushing with every worst-case scenario. The officer was dressed in civilian clothes now, but the badge of authority was still there, hidden beneath his arrogance. Jamal could see the smirk on his face before the officer spoke. "You think you're a hero now, huh?" Reynolds' voice was sharp, mocking. "Little video got you some attention. Congratulations, but don't think it means anything." Jamal stopped in his tracks, his crutches feeling heavier than ever. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. He knew that the officer was trying to provoke him, to push him into a reaction, but Jamal wasn't going to let it happen. "You're not a hero," Reynolds continued, taking a step closer, his voice laced with disdain. "You're just a troublemaker. People like you don't belong in this world. People like you don't get to speak up. You think because some camera caught your little stunt, you can go around thinking you're important now? You don't deserve to be treated like anyone else." Jamal's chest tightened, but he stood his ground. He could feel the fire burning inside him. the fury of 1,000 injustices that had been piled on top of him for years. The words were cruel, but they weren't new. He had heard them all before. They were the words of a man who was terrified of change. The words of someone who feared that the system they had spent their whole life benefiting from was starting to crack. "I'm not looking for anyone to treat me like I'm special," Jamal said, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm looking for people to treat me like I'm human, to treat me with the same dignity they give to anyone else. You don't have the right to tell me I don't belong. You don't get to define who I am." Reynolds's eyes narrowed, his face twisting in a snarl. He stepped even closer, his body tense, as if he was preparing to lash out. "You're nothing. You're just a statistic. Nothing you say is going to change anything. You can stand there all day, making your speeches, but when it comes down to it, you'll always be beneath me." Jamal felt the weight of the officer's words, but the more Reynolds spoke, the more Jamal realized something important. It didn't matter what this man said. He could try to tear him down, try to make him feel small. But Jamal knew who he was now. He wasn't just a bystander in his own life. He wasn't going to shrink away, not anymore. He had a voice. He had a right to stand up for himself, and nothing this officer or anyone else could say would change that. "You're wrong," Jamal said, his voice firm now. "You don't get to decide that. I get to decide who I am. I get to decide my worth. Not you, not anyone." Reynolds' face flushed with rage, his fists clenching by his sides. For a moment, Jamal thought the officer might lash out, but instead, Reynolds took a step back. He gave Jamal one last furious look before turning on his heel and walking away, his boots pounding on the pavement. Jamal stood there for a long moment, his breath shallow, his heart racing. He had done it. He had stood up to the man who had humiliated him. He had faced the very embodiment of the system that had tried to crush him for so long. And he hadn't backed down. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. The officer hadn't been held accountable. The system hadn't changed overnight. But Jamal knew one thing for sure. It was a victory for him. He had taken control of his own story, and no one could take that away from him. As Jamal made his way back home, he passed people who didn't see him, who didn't understand. People who still lived in the bubble of their privilege, who would never understand the weight of being a black man in a world that told him every day that he wasn't enough. But Jamal had stopped caring about their judgment. He had stopped caring about the ones who turned their heads and walked away. He had stopped waiting for permission to exist. When he reached his apartment, he sat down by the window, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the streets. And for the first time in a long time, Jamal felt peace. The road ahead would be long, and the battle was far from over. There would be more fights, more struggles, more moments of humiliation and defeat. But Jamal knew now that he had the strength to keep going. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't a victim. He was a person, a man who had endured, who had fought, and who had survived. And he wasn't going to stop fighting until the world saw him for who he truly was. A person with the right to live, the right to speak, and the right to be seen. Thank you for following along with this story. We'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever experienced or witnessed racism in your life? How do you feel about the events in this story? Your thoughts are incredibly important to us, and we truly value every one of you. Your feedback makes a difference. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us a lot. We appreciate each of you for being here, and we hope you have a wonderful day ahead. Before you go, drop a phrase in the comments that reflects how you feel about this journey. It could be anything that connects you to the story, or something that resonates with the message. We want to know that you're with us all the way to the end.